Hello everyone, welcome to Geography for 10 Landscape Analysis and Green Infrastructure. My name is Irena Rubimtseva and today we are going to focus on health effects of viewing landscapes. Our class today is very much building on the readings of the previous week, so make sure that you complete both required and at least some of the optional readings for the Lab 5 and also review the previous readings based on Lecture 8. So this week we are reading in depth health effects of viewing landscapes, landscape types in environmental psychology by Velarde, Fry, and Tveit, published in Urban Forestry and Urban Greenings. And I also strongly recommend you to check this website, Scenic Solutions, the Science of Scenery, that I will be using quite a lot to introduce the key concepts of this lecture. In this lecture, we are going to explore how landscapes are related to our health, including both physical health and mental health. And the link between landscape and health are increasingly recognized as very important in research and also at the policy level. It is probably more prominent in European literature and school of thought, but you would also find increasing presence of attention to landscapes in research in the United States and other countries as well. So the World Health Organization defined many years ago in 1946 health as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. The European Landscape Convention of the Council of Europe aims to promote landscape protection, management, and planning, considering landscape as a key element of individual and social well-being. So you can see that people have been thinking about the importance of landscapes in health for quite a while. And I want to start our conversation with a few quotes. And I would like to start by a quote of Frederick Olmsted in 1865, who wrote that natural scenery employs the mind without fatigue and yet exercises it, tranquilizes and yet enlivens it, and thus, through the influence of the mind over the body, gives the effect of refreshing rest and reinvigoration of the whole system. So this is very powerful. Let's go from there to another statement by John Muir in 1912. Everybody needs beauty as well as bread, places to play in and pray in, where nature may heal and cheer and give strength to the body and soul. And finally, the quote from President Lyndon Johnson in 1965, beauty can enlarge man's imagination and revive his spirit. So during this semester in GPY for 10, all of you have been tasked to find a case study outside and go there and explore it through a sequence of 5 labs and your research project. And this, for some of you, those are more urban settings or suburban areas or more natural environments, parks, and so on. So let's explore how natural scene and being in the nature can be related to health, and what are those connections and how are they linked through the stress reduction and mental health. So there's a number of different theories explaining why we generally feel better outside, especially when we are exposed to nature. And all of you, probably even working on the labs in my class, I perhaps have noticed that you might be feeling more relaxed or more focused as you are working on your labs in the places of your choice, rather than it's working on the exam or perhaps working on your homework in the library or in the classroom, especially classroom without a window. So why is that? And there's a number of different theories that explain this connection and importance of landscapes in our mental health, well-being, and physical health. I'm going to start with the stress recovery theory that I briefly mentioned last week by Ulrich. which predicts that natural scenes tend to reduce our stress. On the other hand, the settings in the built environment, both indoor and outside in the heavily built urban environments, generally tend to hinder recovery from stress. There are also evolutionary theories of landscape preferences that explain the benefits of natural landscapes as we see them, as reflecting landscape qualities that satisfy human biological needs. So lots of studies hypothesize that this is something biological. Our ancestors have evolved in natural environments, and so it's really our evolutionary need related to our biology. Hill and garden theory, advocated by many psychologists, suggests that nature views aid restoration from stress and improve comfort and well-being. So this figure actually illustrates the differences over the term of the patient's recovery as they are exposed to the nature. Looking at the dose of analgesics, the painkillers, in different settings, and so depending on if the patients were exposed to the view of the wall or the view of the tree, the recovery, as you can see, was significantly better if they were exposed to the view of trees, and they needed significantly less painkillers, based on the study by Ulrich in 1984. And we're going to look at some other studies exploring the same relationships. So according to the Hill and garden theory, the nature views aid restoration from stress and improves comfort and well-being. And you are already a little bit familiar with attention restoration theory that I introduced in the previous lecture. And you know that Professor Herzog, who was working at GVSU for many years and doing this research with his psychology majors here at Grand Valley, has also done significant contributions to the attention restoration theory. So this theory describes the restorative effect of natural environment on human mental fatigue and particularly on students' learning. And therapeutic landscapes concept, another important theory, is exploring the positive healing or therapeutic characteristics of place. So again, you have some examples of the references from the readings and from the bibliographic review paper that we are reading this week. So this is the summary framework of health promoting effects of landscape that I have taken actually from the website that I recommend you as optional reading. And so here we see the model by Zulus et al. In 2007 and Abraham et al. In 2010, showing us this connection of cause and effect between the landscapes and environments and activities in the landscapes, either in the indoor setting or outdoor, when we're exposed to, maybe a view of the nature through the window, or observing trees and water and flowers, horticulture, or when we are outside exercising and walking and running in the nature, we actually experience many psychological and health benefits that result in our self-discipline and well-being, many cognitive benefits, and very important for students. And this is also leading to the social and community health and well-being, which can bring in turn the economic benefits. So you probably remember that a couple of weeks ago, we also spoke about ecological benefits of natural environments, and those psychological or cognitive benefits are kind of less tangible perhaps, but they are very, very important for us. So a few more theories, and we can really put them kind of into two major lines of inquiry: how landscapes affect us and how the landscape heal us. One line of inquiry is associated with studies by Roger Ulrich and his fellows, which proposed the psychoevolutionary evidence in which the positive emotional and psychological effects of experiences with nature have explained the survival benefits. So this is the part of our biological nature. On the other hand, the attention restoration theory proposed by Stephan and Rachel Kaplan suggests that the exposure to nature restores us from the fatigue and prolonged mental work. It's good for our mental health and cognition. And it's really more about how we think that affects than our physical health. So the psychoevolutionary theory by Ulrich and his followers argues that contact with nature aids recovery from all forms of stress. It's much more than just restoration from attention fatigue. The characteristics of the environment provide an early warning signal for safety and survival that triggers positive emotion reactions. So it's really a biological reaction of humans developed through our evolution. And the key elements are a level ground surface, considerable spatial openness, the presence of a pattern or structure, curvy sightlines, and the presence of water. So you are already familiar with some of these ideas if you have read last week the optional readings by Dr. Herzog and his students and his co-authors. You have probably noticed some of these characteristics such as pattern or structure or presence of nature or openness, and we are using these concepts in the Lab 5. So as you are working on the Lab 5, again, you might want to dig into more additional readings. So the response to nature based on this theory is really based on our emotions, not on what we think. It's really more what we feel in the landscape rather than what we think about them. On the other hand, attention restoration theory, or ART, you perhaps remember about ART from our recent quiz and from the Lab 5 that you are doing right now. So this is based on the insights by William James that suggests that we have this voluntary attention, the idea that some things require effort to be focused on. And in the face of the distraction, we might become susceptible to fatigue when we're trying to focus. I'm sure that as students, you are all very, very familiar with this feeling. So the directed attention is needed when we do homework or when we're working on the exam, and it requires effort to achieve focus. So this is really achieved under voluntary control, and it also controls our distraction. When we are working for a long time, when you are doing reading for your classes, or when you're working on some problem-solving exercise or a lab, this is likely to lead to mental exhaustion, to mental fatigue, and then these can be leading to all kind of other mental and physical problems. And so this is something that can be remediated according to this theory by being in the open space and walking in the park, walking in the nature, spending some time to relax and restore yourself and reflect in the nature. So this is really kind of the attention restoration theory in the nutshell. And so this has been developed by the Kaplans, and the Kaplans consider natural settings which are aesthetically pleasing as restorative environments which hold one's attention effortlessly. So when you are working in your lab outside, if you have chosen a pleasant setting, it's probably easier to focus for you on this pleasant environment in the nature in the park rather than working on some assignment in the classroom or in the library or in the lab. So other components of the restorative environment include being away, so that separates us from mental activity and from everyday environment. So being in the park, very different experience than being in the classroom. It's an extent the diversity and scope of environment to provide an alternative setting sufficient to remain engaged. You're much more likely to find much more interesting features and more interesting landscape elements in your study area rather than in the classroom without windows and GVSU. It's also compatibility between the environment and one's purpose and inclination. So this is again our subjective predictive variables from the LAMP5, right? Depending on how familiar or how exotic, how pleasant you find the landscape, it can be not the same for everyone. And fascination. Fascination contains patterns to hold one's attention effortlessly. So boredom is another distracting factor. We can become very, very mentally fatigued simply because we can be very bored of professor's lecture, for example. When you are outside, when you are in the nature, when you are doing your field trip, you can be much more mentally alert and engaged rather than listen to professor in the classroom. So both theories are predicted on the restorative effect of nature having an innate evolutionary basis. And another study by Hartig et al. Considers that these theories are really complementary with regard to the antecedent condition from which the person becomes restored, specifically restored from stress. Both theories approach and research that has been carried out to verify and provide support for nature, providing psychological health and restoration benefits to individuals. So we're going to take a look at a couple of illustrations from Berlardes et al. Paper that we are reading this week in Urban Forestry and Urban Greening article. You will see that most of this review is focusing on the literature analyzing and comparing responses to natural landscapes versus urban landscapes. And so these landscapes are paired along different characteristics. For example, natural landscapes with water and natural landscapes without water, or forest versus golf course, or high openings versus low openings. And within the urban settings, again, the respondents are looking at the landscapes with water and without water, commercial landscapes and industrial areas, mixed residential and light development areas versus very high dense urban areas, again, high openness versus low openness, and they're also looking at canopy shape and inanimate objects, like, for example, buildings and sculptures and so on. And then at the continuous scale, the authors are also looking at the range of exposure to greenery, to green spaces. It would be trees and parks and so on. And so here, the respondents in various studies that are reviewed in this paper really show that greenery does matter. And so there is a very strong preference, as you would find in the paper, to the natural landscapes versus urban landscapes. However, there is some significant variability. So you would find this couple of case studies on page 208 of the paper, where the authors also examine responses from the groups of respondents in landscape health investigations for different categories, such as stressed individuals and hospital users and older people and children who are particularly vulnerable, students and the general public. And within all these categories aggregated, you would also find the health effects of view in landscapes, showing that the natural scenes generally gave a much more positive effect compared to urban landscapes. There are many other studies that also compare natural landscapes to urban landscapes, and pretty much all of them show that natural setting or kind of semi-natural landscapes typically provide us with much higher health benefits. So here we see the effect scores before and after viewing slides for urban scenes on the left and then nature scenes on the right, and the researchers used a very wide range of different measurements, including heartbeat and brain imagery and so on, and they conclude that, when they compare the state of observers before and after viewing the landscapes in general, they see that people feel better after observing natural setting, natural landscape, rather than urban landscape. Of course, there are many other variables involved, again, both objective and subjective, and I am very interested to know, as you are doing the Lab 5, what you would find about your own observations in this lab. So these apparently also, these concepts apply not only to what we see outside, but studies suggest that the same pretty much applies also to the interior design. That's why greenery inside is also important for us. It's not only about purifying our air, it's also about feeling well as we're exposed to natural elements. So applying these findings to the interior design, Ulrich actually finds that sensory deprivation, such as windowless rooms, can result in anxiety and depression. Based on the evolutionary approach, he also wrote that the most effective positive distractions are mainly elements that have been important to humans throughout millions of years of evolution, and this is happy, laughing, or caring faces, animals, and nature elements such as trees, plants, and water. So exposure to natural landscapes is a very, very real need for humans. This is also foundational for a theory of supportive design. A theory of supportive design aims to improve the capability of hospitals and other healthcare providers to enhance health outcomes through more effectively reducing stress for patients, families, visitors, as well as the employees. And so it aims to provide access to nature through windows, health gardens, and even posters inside of the hospital buildings and healthcare facilities. So again, Ulrich's research is finding that immediate, unconsciously triggered and initiated emotional responses, not controlled cognitive responses, play a central role in the initial level of responding to nature. And he has written extensively on the design of health facilities and focusing specifically on this exposure to nature. So this is another study by Galindo and Rodriguez in 2000, looking at a wide range of respondents and measuring their aesthetical judgment, right? How much do you like or don't like the landscape, and what is their aesthetic attractiveness, a general preference of the landscape, and looking at specifically things such as how comfortable you are with the landscape, how excited or distressed you are, and also looking at boredom and tranquility and safety. So very similar to what we did in the Lab 5 at the small scale. And again, they are finding that in general, there's a strong preference for natural landscapes. You're already familiar with the work by Herzog, so that was our required reading last week. And so he found that natural settings had high restorative potential with urban settings, while urban settings had low potential, and supporting and entertainment settings were intermediate. He and Chernik examined that the relationship of tranquility with perceived danger in urban and natural settings, again suggests that people are really kind of scared of urban alleys, regardless if they are really dangerous, but this is just kind of their immediate response to observed landscapes. So they included degree of care shown in the setting, and it also had been assumed that kind of scruffy side is more likely to attract dangerous elements. Again, this is something that we feel in the landscape, regardless if this is true or not. This study was actually based on 230 GVSU students who viewed images and rated tranquility, and so they found that tranquility rated much higher in natural than in urban settings, while danger rated higher in urban settings. This could be partly subjective, right? Because like most of GVSU students, especially in 2000, probably were more from rural and suburban areas rather than urban areas. And so it's very possible that their familiarity with the landscape also affected their impressions. Tranquility and danger were negatively correlated across all settings. Openings, setting care, and nature related positively to tranquility and related negatively to danger. And the degree of care for the natural and urban environments was most important for the perception of danger in urban areas than in natural settings. So again, you are using the same criteria for the Lab 5. So I'm very, very interested to read your reports and see what you would find through your own experiments in this lab. Another similar study on Italian students in Padua was also looking at industry housing, city streets, hills, and lakes, different elements of the landscapes by Purcell et al. And so these authors actually assessed the extent by which their restorative effects correlated with preference and familiarity to other subjective characteristics that we are using in the Lab 5. And so they concluded that the highest restoration and preference was for areas with hills and lakes, and it was much more so than for the urban scenes. So here we have a very similar conclusion to what Herzig found at GVSU from the other side of the globe. Rachel Kaplan surveyed residents in low-rise apartments in Ann Arbor, here in Michigan, with views of parks, streams, woods, and landscape grounds, and found that the results provided considerable support for the premise that having natural elements or settings in the view from the windows contributes substantially to residents' satisfaction with their neighborhood and with diverse aspects of their sense of well-being. And again, you have probably noticed this yourself, depending on where you live, on campus or off campus, what you see around, what you see through the window has significant impact on how you feel. So classrooms with views of trees and shrubs actually improve students' performance and behavior in terms of test scores, graduation rates, continuing on the college, and less criminal behavior. This is another study in 2010. And classrooms with views of trees and shrubs, yes, again, help you to learn. So there's kind of this overwhelming benefit, overwhelming evidence that many benefits provided us by the view of greenery. So Groenewegen actually coined this term vitamin G. So vitamin G is not a real vitamin. This is the presence of greenery in the landscape or green space. And so those are effects of green space on health, well-being, and social safety. And there is a strong correlation between green space in the living environment that provides exposure to behavior selection. You can engage in various activity in the green spaces, and this in turn promotes health and well-being and social safety in the community. So this is based on another study conducted in the Netherlands. And there's another study also from the Netherlands by De Vries et al., who used self-reported health data of over 10,000 Dutch people and combined it with land use data on the amount of green space in their living environment. And so what they found is that with a greater green space, people's health, individual mental health was much better, and the effect was quite substantial. So 10% more of green space was actually lowering the symptoms by the equivalent of 5 years of age. All types of green were found to be effective, including the difference was between brick and green environment is really the key rather than variation of the green. So it doesn't matter if there were trees or gardens or open green spaces. So green space is particularly important for those who are at home the most. And so here, they're looking at housewives, essentially parents who take care of children, elderly, and children. And this is probably proven again itself during the pandemic when the exposure to greenery was making a huge difference in people's health as they were confined last year at home. So it is the amount of green space within the living environment which is really the most relevant rather than the distance, as this research has concluded. Maas et al. Conducted research on the relationship between health and green space, and again they found a very clear correlation, finding that health differences in residents of urban and rural areas are to a large degree explained by the amount of green space. And this is a summary study. This is a synthesis of a huge number of different studies who are all looking at the impact of natural landscapes, nature scenes versus urban scenes, and they all found, look, on average the mean was 168% higher preference and much more positive impact of natural environments versus urban environments on various aspects of people's psychological recovery and students learning, and reducing anxiety and reducing depression, pain killing effect, and so on. So see a range of different areas where we see benefits of green spaces over traditional urban spaces. So that really tells us how much greenery is even more important within the urban landscapes. So this is again a summary of various studies looking at restorative power of nature. And you can see here the percentage increase of all these different variables over urban scenes. So here we see perceived restorative scale and favorite sites versus unpleasant sites. Scientists were also looking at the electrocephalography, how the brain is responding to different landscapes, as well as electromyography. They were also looking at the heart rate. And so all the studies that kind of comparing favorite and unpleasant landscapes, and they are all showing that there is a very strong preference of nature scene, either, it could be vegetation, it could be water, versus walls of buildings. So a few conclusions from there as you are starting to work on your Lab 5 report. Viewing and experiencing nature provides substantial emotional and psychological benefits, and there is clearly overwhelming evidence supported by empirical studies. The preference for nature scenes is more than 2/3 greater than of urban scenes, where the restorative benefits of nature are at least 3 times as higher than viewing urban landscapes. Exposure to green spaces in city is absolutely vitally important, improving health and even reducing morbidity. And the research findings should be also applied to the design of hospitals, offices, schools, and homes to ensure views and access to greenery, to the design of cities to integrate green spaces more into their design and ensure the access of green spaces by their residents. So this is really the question of public health. Nobody should be deprived from access to green spaces. So I hope you are enjoying your work on the Lab 5. I think it's a great experiment. I hope you are also setting up your own experiment with 2 pictures from your study area and observing responses of your friends or your parents or your roommates or your family members. And so I want to leave you with this view of the Garden City in Singapore, where you can see a very successful integration of greenery in the urban landscape. Enjoy your day, and I hope to learn more about your research as you are concluding the Lab 5.